They called it gentility, a word that floated through parlors and drawing rooms, masking the rot beneath. Behind those grand plantation walls, where chandeliers glowed and whispers carried through the night, power became perversion. What looked like refinement was built on cruelty, and what they called order was nothing more than domination dressed in silk. They told the world that slavery was about work, about fields, about cotton, about labor. But inside those homes, behind those locked doors, lived another truth. Enslaved black men, whose bodies were already claimed by law, became targets of secret abuse by women whose faces history would later paint as pure. They smiled in portraits, their hands folded neatly in white gloves, but some carried a darker power, one that thrived on silence. What happens when power wears a smile and cruelty hides behind lace and perfume? When a gentle voice gives commands that can never be refused? That is the question hidden in the corridors of every mansion, behind every polite word and quiet dinner. The plantations of the 18th and 19th centuries were worlds of hierarchy and fear. Every step, every glance, every breath belonged to someone else. White men ruled with law and violence. White women lived in their shadow, silenced in public yet powerful in private. And below them all, enslaved people endured a life that offered no safety, not even in sleep. In this hidden world, every relationship was governed by power. The enslaved were expected to obey completely. They cleaned, served, and endured under the gaze of both master and mistress. Yet within those elegant walls, another kind of control thrived, one that was never spoken of but deeply understood. Every person was owned, every moment watched, every mistake punished. But within the mistress's domain, there were no witnesses. The plantation might have belonged to the master, but the house was hers. It was her kingdom, and inside its walls, the word was law. In this fragile empire of manners and cruelty, enslaved men faced dangers that went beyond the fields. They were forced into positions of service that blurred the line between labor and subjugation. Their strength was admired, their silence expected, their suffering ignored. The very things that made them human, their pride, their resilience, their dignity, became threats to be controlled. Slavery was more than chains and whips. It was a complete system of psychological warfare. Power seeped into the smallest details: a look, a tone, a word. The enslaved were stripped of their names, their stories, their right to be seen as men or women. They existed as property, denied the simplest right of refusal. In this world, resistance was death. The law said that an enslaved person could not say no. They had no body to protect, no voice to defend it, no truth that anyone would believe. Their oppressors understood that power wasn't only in the whip, it was in silence. It was in the things that could never be spoken aloud. And in that silence, white mistresses found a kind of power that both defied and reinforced the cruelty of their world. Denied authority over their own lives, they discovered control over others, and sometimes that control turned dark. Some mistresses, trapped in loveless marriages and rigid social rules, redirected their anger and loneliness toward those beneath them. The enslaved became their mirror, their outlet, their secret weapon against helplessness. In their hands, authority turned to manipulation. Emotional punishment became physical. Attention became coercion. A touch was not affection, it was ownership. Behind locked doors, commands became violations disguised as privilege. The enslaved man had no right to refuse, no safety in resistance. It was never about desire. It was always about power. To the outside world, these women were models of grace. They wrote letters about God and virtue, about gardens and family. But in the spaces between their words, history now sees the shadows. Their personal attendants, their favored servants, their special helpers, terms written delicately to hide something unspeakable. For the enslaved men trapped in those roles, there was no escape. They lived every hour under threat from the master who owned them, from the mistress who commanded them, from a world that would kill them if they spoke. Even in the quiet of night, they were never free. When even the darkness offered no refuge, where could an enslaved man hide? Some carried the burden in silence, surviving one day at a time. Others were punished for things they never did, accused of disrespect or defiance when their only crime was refusing submission. Their pain became invisible, buried beneath generations of fear, and yet, the house remained quiet. No record, no testimony, no confession. Only the walls knew what happened behind the veil of gentility. How do you heal from a wound that history refused to admit existed? The answer lies buried in archives, in forgotten diaries, in whispers passed down through families. But even centuries later, the silence still trembles with memory. The truth of these hidden acts did not vanish. It lingered in fragments in words half erased from journals, in stories the descendants could barely whisper. But for centuries, no one wanted to see them. History protected the image of white womanhood like a sacred thing, while the enslaved men they violated were erased, blamed, or forgotten. The official story painted these women as fragile, pure, untouched by the filth of slavery. But power is never pure. It corrupts, it stains, and it leaves its mark on those who hold it too long. Behind every polite phrase, he was loyal, he served faithfully, he never left her side. There was another story. These men did not serve willingly, they endured. They obeyed because defiance could mean a noose, a whipping, or a slow death. They were forced to carry the weight of white desire while being stripped of the right to their own. To the enslaved man, the mistress's command was as deadly as the master's whip. If she summoned him, he had to come. If she smiled, he had to obey. Refusal was impossible, because in that world, his word meant nothing. The smallest rumor, a whisper that he was disrespectful, could end his life. The same society that feared black masculinity in public consumed it in private, feeding on the bodies of the men it enslaved. These acts were not born of passion, but of domination. They were not love stories, but crimes of silence. When the mistress took what she wanted, she was not defying her husband, she was asserting her own small piece of supremacy. She could not control her world, but she could control him. The enslaved man became her outlet for rage, for loneliness, for power denied. The cruelty was quiet, personal, intimate. It left no visible scars that history could measure, but it shattered the human soul. The enslaved men who survived carried the shame of crimes committed against them, but they could never speak it. The plantation was a stage built on fear, and silence was survival. In the years that followed, when these men's descendants told stories of their ancestors, the details blurred, the names faded, the words, "she took him," or "he was made to serve," appeared in coded language, hidden beneath politeness. The truth became a ghost, haunting every generation that came after. But history has a way of speaking, even through the things it tried to erase. In the 20th century, scholars began to search for the missing pieces, reading the diaries, the ledgers, the oral histories with new eyes. They noticed patterns: favored servants always male, certain names appearing in both the mistress's letters and the master's punishments. They saw that some enslaved men disappeared suddenly, sold away after serving too closely in the house. One historian wrote that in the silence of archives, absence itself is evidence. The missing words, the erased sentences, the deliberate forgetting all point toward truths too dangerous to speak aloud. The more the scholars looked, the clearer it became. These weren't isolated rumors. They were part of a system that weaponized silence. The history books had always told one half of the story: the brutal assaults of white men against enslaved women, the children born from violence. But they never mentioned the other side, the nights when white women crossed the same forbidden line. Society could not bear that image. It would have shattered the myth of white purity that justified slavery's moral order. So the world turned away. The victims were silenced, and the perpetrators were sanctified. It was easier to believe that all white women were gentle, that all black men were dangerous, than to face the fact that sometimes the roles reversed and power wore a dress. The cost of that silence has echoed through generations. The descendants of those enslaved men inherited not just trauma, but confusion, a deep, unspoken wound in their lineage. Some grew up hearing strange stories of the house or the lady, never knowing the full horror of what those words meant. Some carried the genetic trace of their oppressors without ever being told how it came to be. And yet, even now, society struggles to face this truth. To acknowledge these crimes means dismantling centuries of myth. It means admitting that white womanhood, so often portrayed as the victim of history, could also be its enforcer. That beneath the lace and the manners lay cruelty as sharp as any whip. But the evidence will not stay buried. DNA studies have begun to reveal bloodlines that connect black families to the white women who once owned them. In old Southern archives, letters once thought harmless have revealed, coded, confessions, notes about trustworthy boys, quiet help, those who must not be mentioned. Each phrase a mask for domination, for abuse, for the unthinkable. The truth began to surface not because anyone confessed, but because the silences could no longer hold. The more historians read between the lines, the more they realize that history's most disturbing truths live in what was never written down. To speak of these acts is not to rewrite history, it is to finally finish it. For too long, the stories of enslaved men have been limited to strength and labor, stripped of their vulnerability, their pain, their humanity. But true strength was in their survival and their ability to endure what no man should have had to. They bore the unbearable. They walked with heads bowed not from shame, but from the knowledge that to stand tall was to die. Their silence was not weakness, it was resistance. They survived by swallowing their screams. For generations, this truth remained hidden behind polite words, buried beneath the myth of white innocence. But every lie eventually collapses under its own weight. And when it does, the ghosts of history step forward, demanding to be heard. Because the plantation may be gone, but its shadow remains. It lives in the stories untold, in the pain unnamed, in the way society still chooses who gets to be a victim and who does not.